is definitely something is definitely happening here tonight. We'll be taking a look at the lasting effect of the 60s as seen through two different lenses. One through the prism of San Francisco, and another as seen through a lens worn in Los Angeles, both envisioned by talented writers with a lot to say about how what happened then affects what's happening now. One thing I want to remind everybody of, we would love to hear your questions tonight. So if you have any questions, you'll see on the bottom of your screen a little Q&A tab. Please click on that, type away, and near the end of the evening, we will get to all of those. But tonight we are so lucky that one of the authors joining us is Carla Malden, author of Shine Until Tomorrow. It's interesting that Carla's novel is the one set in San Francisco because it was Carla who was raised in Los Angeles. And Carla worked in motion picture production before becoming a screenwriter, and her feature writing has often appeared in the Los Angeles Times. With her father, Carl Malden, she co-authored his wonderful memoir, When Do I Start? Carla has also written a beautiful, touching memoir of her own and a novel, and now Shine Until Tomorrow. It's a poignant, funny novel. It's a novel for the young adult in your life or for your life. Blythe Danner has talked about how eloquently Carla writes, and it is such a joy, Carla, to see you again. Welcome tonight.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thanks for having us.
Of course. And we're incredibly thrilled that joining Carla tonight in conversation is Arin Keshishian. Like I said, both authors are using California as a backdrop in their stories in a time that at once seemed so long ago, but also because of the influence of the 60s and fashion and music and art that is still all around us today, it can also seem just like yesterday. Arin's story centers around a young man who left France and moved first to San Francisco and then to LA, much like Arin himself, who left France with his family in the 90s and settled in Southern California. Arin is a graduate of UCLA, where he studied English and French literature. He speaks not one or two languages, as you might expect for an expat, and not even 3 or 4, but 5. His obvious love of language comes through in his remarkable novel, A Tale of Two Wise Fools. And like I said, it's a thrill to have him with us tonight. Arin, welcome to you.
Hi, thanks so much, Nick. Thanks for welcoming us. Hope everybody's doing well.
Indeed, indeed. Well, again, we're going to have a terrific conversation tonight. If we could, though, I would like to bend your arms just a little bit, just so that everybody gets a little taste of the novel. I'm going to have you both read a little bit. But before we do that, if you have an elevator speech to kind of tell everybody what your novels are about, obviously sort of spoiler free, but to just give them a glimpse of what the novel is, so that when you do read, we have, kind of a good basis for that. Carla, would you like to go first and just briefly describe your novel?
My novel, as you said, was conceived as a young adult novel, though it's been really gratifying to see that it's crossed over with, as you said, the young at heart adults as well. It's about a young girl, 17 years old, who's she has a lot of barriers between herself and her peers. She's the child of divorce. She has a lot of walls that she has constructed around her. And in fact, her hobby and her passion is photography, which sort of serves as a metaphor because she uses that lens to distance herself from relationships and the world around her. And it's a quote unquote time travel piece because she gets a bump on the head, sort of Wizard of Oz-esque, and finds herself back in 1967 San Francisco, the summer of love. And I say again in quotes, a time travel piece, because it's nothing in the vein of science fiction or even fantasy or magical reality, none of that. It's more of, I think every 17-year-old girl has a really rich fantasy life. So we don't really know if it's that. We don't know if it's the bump on the head or if indeed she's gone back in time.
Right.
And it's the thumbnail is, it's about this young girl obsessed with her future, about wanting to go to Yale and get on with the business of being an adult, who has to travel to the past to learn to live in the present.
That is really a wonderful way of describing it. Oh my gosh, Carla, thank you so much. Arin, how about you? Can you give us a brief glimpse into Two Wise Fools?
Yeah, it's a story really about a young 19-year-old who's from France, you know, so who's lived, I guess, some years in San Francisco before moving to LA. So I'm able to obviously, he's able to speak English in the novel. So it's really about him being lost after a breakup with his, you know, only girlfriend, and who he's met in San Francisco. And he's trying to find himself in LA, starting anew at this point in 1970. You know, so it's kind of leaving the 60s behind, with the novel still having the influence of the 60s behind him. That's still kind of, he carries that flame with him. And he's just trying to discover, you know, more about himself, and ends up meeting an old man who's, you know, in his 70s at a bar. So he's lived, you know, all the 20th century pretty much, and he's been through a lot, and he's learning from him through drinking excessively over time when he's spending with this old man. And as they drink, they open up about a lot that they've gone through. And it's really about, you know, two wise fools, meaning that anyone's a wise fool, really. I think it's just at the end, it's a story about us as people bonding and finding that we're wise in certain things and foolish in others. So it's like the two sides, we're like a coin with these two sides, you know, at all times. And sometimes in life you flip that coin and you fall on the wise side or the foolish side, you know, depending on, how you see things and the decisions you make. But it's really just about, briefly, it's the plot really takes place in the minds and hearts of these two human beings. And as they go through things and as they meet other people, perhaps, and so on and so forth, and the places they go.
Right.
So that's really the story. Yeah.
Well, I have to say, Arin mentions that the two main characters in the book spend a lot of time in bars drinking, and I have to say, you know, reading this book, you know, during the pandemic, and Carla, yours with, you know, so much is happening outdoors and in Golden Gate Park and just throngs of people. Both works really made me miss those pre-pandemic times. So thank you for you know, making this reader wince, but wince in a very good way. So like I said, I am going to have you both read a little bit, but before I have you do that, first, I think it was great to have you both kind of set the scene for both of your books in your own words. But I did want to start both at the beginning and at the end of your books, because Carla, your book begins with an epigraph. You quote a fabulous Bob Dylan song, and he talks about standing guard, or that his guard was standing hard, and that abstract thoughts made him think that he had something to protect. And that image of a guard is really interesting, because then Arin, at the end of your book, you finish with lines from Rilke, where he talks about how the highest bond between people is to stand guard over the solitude of the other. And so I was really struck by the fact that one of these books begins with that image of guarding something, and the other book ends with an image of guarding something. And I was wondering if both of you could just take a moment to reflect on why you think, Carla, in your case, you began with that image, and then Arin, for you, why do you think it was important to end with that image?
Well, I think the Bob Dylan quote, which is from the song "My Back Pages," and I picked that particular verse for that very reason that you're talking about. And it's what I was alluding to, that she is at the beginning of the book, her salient characteristic is guardedness.
Mm-hmm.
She guards herself from being hurt. She's so sensitive and she's so smart, and she can deflect with language so well that she feels she's sort of got the world wired. But in fact, she's so vulnerable to pain that her MO on a day-to-day basis is to make sure that she remains guarded. And then, so that's why I picked that particular verse. And then, of course, you know, the famous line at the end of the chorus, which I include, is, but I was so much older then, I'm
Right.
younger than that now, which plays into the time travel and really to the evolution of her spirit through the course of the book.
That really is a wonderful, the way that lyric ends, especially with what we're about to jump into with the book, is quite lovely. Arin, how about you? Why did you think, or why do you think it was important for you to begin or to end with those lines from Rilke?
Well, you know, he's Adrian, the young man, when he talks to Max being the older gentleman, who's gone through so much. And then there's one portion in the novel where I talk about that, you know, even at a young age, Adrian understands that there's certain, you know, people are allowed their secret gardens or their cemeteries, so to speak. So they have these things that there may be, you know, that's very personal, little secret gardens or cemeteries, things that perhaps they're not so proud of, and regrets and things like that. And you should never, you know, coerce somebody to get those out from the people. So, you know, you stand guard, I guess. It was something beautiful that I thought that it's you know, respectful to stand over the solitude of the other. So if that person, you know, wants to have that solitude, so something they don't want to talk about, it's their little secret place that they visit in their own solitude. And I think you know, it's just being respectful and mindful of people's privacy, you know, things that, you know, about things that are personal and they went through. And
right.
Yeah.
Again, and in the same way that Carla's verse really kind of foreshadowed what we were going to experience, I do think that it was brilliant, the way, you know, those lines from, you know, Letters to a Young Poet really reflect back and kind of echo what we've just experienced through the novel. So again, kudos to both of you. I know that, you know, epigraphs, closing lines can be really difficult, and oh my gosh, you both absolutely nailed those choices. So again, I really feel like as a reader, it's such a joy to hear the words of an author through their own voice. So if we could take a moment to have you both read a little bit from your works, that would be terrific. Let's start with Arin, and if you could just, you know, set us up a little bit, you know, let us know, you know, a little bit about what you're going to read, and then go ahead.
Sure. This is one of the chapters where Max and Adrian, they visited the old house that Max used to live in when he was a young boy, and it's in disrepair. So he hasn't visited that place in Lord knows how long, decades perhaps. So, you know, so they end up visiting this place together. So I'll start somewhere in the middle of this chapter. I prefer to live alone, kid. No offense to you. Understandable, I shrugged. He sank deeper in thought, his eyes relaxed as he looked around him. I glanced at the wine bottle. Inside were pieces of disintegrated cork, staying afloat in the small amount of wine that was still left. I looked around and picked up what appeared to be an old dust-covered photo album from the floor. I opened it, and it was exactly just that. There were creased and aged photographs, colorless at first glance, but were certainly colorful in stories I knew nothing about, but which I could take to my imagination to compensate. Too many photos, they flood the gates of the mind with too many memories, and that creates sadness. I don't want anything to do with them anymore, Max said quietly. I slowly closed the album to avoid disturbing the dust. There's so much sadness here, Max continued. Yeah, have you seen the condition of this place? Yeah, well, aside from all that, certain feelings are just inescapable. What's going on through your mind, Max? Ah, forget it, he said, dismissing me with a swift gesture of his hand. Ah, come on. It's nothing, kid. He was quiet. We both stared around for a moment before he finally broke the silence. You ever get the feeling old souls are paying you a visit? I know what you mean, but I believe they're within us, within you already. Oh, yeah? Yeah, they're there, deep inside. We just choose to ignore them with drugs, booze, TV, a meaningless 9-to-5 job. I like it. Somehow it makes sense. I was surprised. I never thought Max would ever buy into any of this, but he had begun welcoming ideas he hadn't before. Then again, he'd lived with a degree of inner madness for some time now. Sometimes we just have to put on that scuba gear, strap on the mask and oxygen tank, and dive deep in the ocean within us. We have to become the Jacques Cousteau of our depths. It's the only way we can learn more about ourselves, help cultivate our minds, and feel around for a purpose, you know? I continued. Yeah, only problem is, in my case, it's full of ancient shipwrecks deep down that are slowly deteriorating. Yeah, you're an ancient wreck of a man. Hell, look at you. You surpassed the Titanic. Actually, you're more like a Spanish galleon with all of its rusty cannons resting peacefully at the bottom of the sea. No one's perfect, kid, Max smiled. When a ship is sinking, that's the most horrifying moment. Sailors losing their lives, it's devastating. That sure is. You may be full of shipwrecks, but old shipwrecks have beauty too. In time, they've got all that marine life growing on them and living inside them. They change and become covered with life again. You've just got to plunge down into those depths once more and explore it all for yourself. See that change within you that's been going on for so long. See the transformation. Maybe even come to an understanding with those wrecks. Silence took hold of the house for a moment. Max glanced around the room and took a sip of the god-awful wine when my mind started to wander. Somehow I couldn't help but romanticize that we were very much like two shipwrecked men who had just crawled to shore in a deserted island, though I knew very well we were really just a couple of booze-wrecked men leaning against the walls of an abandoned house, sincere children of escapism, playing hide-and-go-seek with our own lost souls, hoping to be found and saved. But by whom? Out of the wrecks, the smoke and ashes of yesterday sprout the seeds of tomorrow. Even wrecks can teach you a few things, Max finally said in a melancholy tone. And I'd like to end it here.
That's really great. I love that portion of the book. It is so reminiscent of the Odyssey, when he, wakes up, in that green wood. I just love that. And the other thing that I love is that you chose a passage where they're looking at an old photo album, which just so happens to be how Carla's book also begins, with the discovery of a photo album by our, lead character, who realizes that, oh my gosh, my parents actually had a life before me. That's rather interesting. So wonderful kismet there. Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
Carla, if you could again set the stage a little bit and then read for us.
Yeah, I'm going to read a few pages, about a third of the way into the book, where our girl Mari has found herself back in the summer of love, San Francisco, and she's been picked up literally in a psychedelically painted van, because she doesn't know where she is, by a garage band, rock and roll band who live in the Haight, and they take her to Golden Gate Park, and she's already overwhelmed, and this is what she finds there. Of course, I've heard of these things, love-ins and be-ins and all that, but now that I think about it, I always assumed the whole peace and love thing had been exaggerated for the sake of myth. My parents' generation, the baby boomers, likes to fan the flames of hype about their youth, as though they invented youth itself, as though they were the only group who ever got it right, as though it weren't so pathetic that they still think they're young. But this scene in the park is for real. a crowd stretching as far as I can see, a proverbial sea of people that ebbs and flows as though a collective spell has been cast. Full-on Fellini circus, a surge of pulsing colors, banners and flags wave in the sunshine, balloons hover overhead, punctuating the sky. Food appears, hunks of bread along with giant cookies and wine. You can smell the wine, fruity and earthy and like vinegar. So much skin, human canvases painted with flowers and peace symbols. Naked toddlers finger paint each other with mud, pausing to suck on a bare breast now and then. A girl in a see-through dress prances around a guy cross-legged on the ground playing guitar. A couple is hooking up right there under a thin parachute, a tangle of denim cast to the side. The sun flashes off a dress made of foil as the breeze whips beaded fringe dangling from ponchos and jackets and high suede boots. Someone in the distance is blowing giant soap bubbles. They rise over the park, shimmering and iridescent. Ribbons extending from a pole sail over the crush of people. The pole topped with a peace symbol made to look like stained glass, which seems fitting because there's this surreal ceremonial feel to the whole scene, like a field of woodland nymphs has crawled out of the brushes and gathered to participate in some tribal ritual. Bits and pieces of pagan sacraments jumbled together, presided over by self-imagined shamans. And so much music, flutes and guitars, mandolins and dulcimers, bells and cymbals and gongs, drums pounding out what I suppose can only be called, more than a little nauseatingly, a communal heartbeat. Suddenly, a long drawn-out sound pierces the air. A trumpet, maybe. No, nothing brass. There's nothing sharp to the sound, and not a woodwind. Just a single note, more like a tone, echoing over the crowd, the pitch wavering ever so slightly. For a second, I think it's a recording of a whale calling to his fellow pod members deep underwater. But that's not it. Someone somewhere in this human pod is blowing a conch shell. And then a long, protracted Om over the loudspeaker. No cosmic key left unturned. Welcome to America's nervous breakdown, booms a voice from the stage. Cheers, hollers, applause. An enormous American flag waves high above the throng. In place of stars, a giant peace symbol.
First, that's just brilliant. Second, Carla, it's almost as if you crawled inside my head, because that absolutely leads into the first question that I wanted to ask you. So set the scene so remarkably well. And I wanted to talk about scene setting. We had Arin in his scene talk about, that wonderful observation that shipwrecks, that from destruction, right, eventually there is growth. And then really I have in my notes, talk about Golden Gate Park, talk about the Fellini circus, and the fact that you chose that exact scene to read. Bless you for that. Scene setting is so important in both your novels. We have these two stories that obviously are taking place just a few years apart. Carla, you actually describe an actual psychedelic shop. That's the name of the shop, which I think is just wonderful. It's exquisite. The details there, the incense, the posters with the 60s swirls. Arin, Adrian has a copy of Rolling Stone by his bed. Max has a 49 Oldsmobile that is kind of taking on this patina of the 60s as it, slowly turns pea green and I think burnt orange. So both of you really go out of your way to set the scene for where we are, so that the reader knows exactly on every page where these stories are taking place. And I kind of have two questions for both of you. First, how important was it for both of you to get it right? Number one. But secondly, why did you choose the late 60s and early 70s for your stories? Because the scene setting does kind of merge with the story itself. So again, I'm wondering if you both can talk a little bit about how important the scene setting is, but then more importantly, why you chose the time and place for where your stories do take place.
I'll go.
Go
Sorry,
ahead.
Carla, how about you go?
Really important to me to get it right. I steeped myself in that. As you said, I found a place that was, really called the Psychedelic Shop, and the place where they sold past tense, sold love burgers for 25 cents. I did a lot of research, a lot of picture books.
Wait, that's true? There was a Love Burger shack?
There was a love burger, 25 cents, sign in the window.
Love it.
Signed in a heart. Almost every detail, I think every detail that cites a place was true. So I really researched that. It was very important to me. And in terms of why I chose that time period for her to go back to, there was no other time period, as far as I was concerned, where she could learn what she needed to learn to evolve as a human being. Because that time period, it's optimism, it's sort of naive idealism. I mean, the 60s, what historians call the 60s, are from 63 to 74, starting with the assassination really of John Kennedy, and then to 74, when the Vietnam War was winding down, and there was really no longer anything for a counterculture to counter. When it was sort of the death of the counterculture was its success, paradoxically, because there wasn't anything to fight against in the same, urgent sort of way. So she had to go back to that period of time, because all those things that I just talked about were anathema to her. A sense of community, a sense of openness, the sense that an individual and a group together could change the world. All those things were anathema to her. So she had to really go back and absorb them to learn what she needed to learn.
Okay. Excellent. Arin, how about you?
Well, I just simply, I've always been obsessed with the 60s and 70s, especially like the latter half of the 60s and the earlier part of the 70s, particularly, especially with music and with fashion and movies. And so for me, it's just close to the heart. It was an era that was easier for me to talk about. I love researching about that particular era, so it made writing about it just as more interesting. And I didn't want to write something contemporary because everything's there. It's like you can do some research, but it's not the same. Like for instance, and you were talking about certain details in the book that, if I was nitpicky about it, it's like, I wanted to make sure I got as much as correct as possible. And if somebody says, oh, by the way, we didn't, those weren't made in that particular material in those days, and I would have been like, darn, I didn't do my research on that, and I should have. One of them in particular, I'll mention this because it's kind of funny. It may seem like nothing, but I was really passionate, and I was like driven to find out. It was the aluminum foil on a champagne bottle. So and so apparently in those days they were made of lead. They were made of lead, and I went into detail, and I described it that it was made of aluminum, and then I went back and I said, wait, that might not be the right material. And interestingly enough, it was lead. So I changed it to lead foil as opposed to aluminum. Tiny little thing, but it just pays off sometimes to do a lot of research, and it is time consuming. But overall, it was just it was a great pleasure just finding out these little things historically that maybe I even learned that I didn't know, that I thought I knew, but I got corrected with research. Yeah.
Steeped in, again, bar culture, that I can see you getting that detail correct about champagne bottles. So it's interesting. And both of you, Both of your characters really show kind of a mistrust. Um, Arin, in your case, your main character shows a mistrust of kind of, capitalism, the government, and Carla, of course, she more, since she's, a child of this age, runs into people that show that mistrust. There's a wonderful moment where she doesn't really know yet that she's in the 60s, and she mentions eBay, and one of her new friends kind of nods sort of conspiratorially, and he's like, it's a government thing, right? And she's kind of like, what? And Adrian in the book is scolded by an older friend who he basically would like to have a relationship with, and she just sort of shakes her head because she believes that he does not, he's not fulfilling his duty, right? Getting a good job, kind of feeding into the capitalist machine. Both of those notions are so central to sort of the 60s ethos that we've all grown up with. And I'm just wondering, how important was it that you got that into the book? And more importantly, what is the purpose of having that sort of mistrust be such an important part of both of these stories that are so different and yet, share so many things? And this time, Arin, you're going to go first.
Okay. Well, I think Adrian wants to be very much, he doesn't want to be joining communes or try to join big groups. He's very much a one-on-one type of person. He did basically kind of disappear from his family and friends for certain reasons that maybe are deeper than those that are mentioned, for instance. But the gist of it is there. He's somebody who's kind of like, this lone wolf character who, goes through life just trying to find certain things about people that can help him maybe find a certain direction within himself. And I think some of the mistrust, right, the whole thing with the 9 to 5, and that was obviously not what it was looking for. And he was still working at the restaurant, right? So he had to obviously work somewhere. Right. And he just, was a minimalist. The place he had was probably like this studio, very small, didn't have too many things. He loved albums, and because music, that was a good conduit for him to plug into, to kind of just free himself a little bit from everything else. But
right, he can pack up his entire life at near the end in a suitcase.
That's right. And he has this busy mind, right? He's always thinking, he's always self-reflecting. He's so, trying to find somebody else to plug into. And it was basically this kind of guy. He loved to find a certain energy and plug into that. And he would just want to be there in this case, that was with Max, and I guess so. As far as mistrust, I don't know if I can go into deeper things about that. It's more really about self-discovery, self-reflection, finding some kind of sense to what he's experienced. Maybe he's done too many drugs in the 60s. We don't know. But, he's trying to basically find another path somewhere, in a new era of America that was changing as well. America was very much changing by the early 70s as well, because they just went through the 60s. They went through the grinder, and now they're kind of, there's something that's still going on in America that's maybe different from what happened, but it was a country, I think, that was trying to find itself again, especially you can tell a lot of people talk about it with fashion, how it was so wild by the 70s. And people to this day don't even know what to make of 70s fashion. They can't see a positive in it. So I see a positive in it,
right.
But it's interesting. Yeah.
Well, and like Carla said also that, the 60s kind of ended, in 68 with those two horrible assassinations. And so the fact that your book takes place immediately after that and Carla's takes place immediately before is also something that I found very interesting because there is that schism in the 60s, and you both are showing kind of different parts of that. Carla, how about you? Was it important to get that kind of, and the one thing that I want to say about this is that you both do this. You talk about capitalism or anti-capitalism without being pedantic at all, which is really easy to do, right? We can, make fun of the man, and then the book just becomes a diatribe, which, nobody wants to read. But Carla, how about for you? Was that an important thread that you wanted to weave into your story?
We know it's interesting. Like I had never really thought about it in terms of mistrust, except for in terms of her character. I think of the piece as being really character driven, and all the color kind of swirling around her of the 60s bolsters that. But life has let her down. As I mentioned,
Right.
she's a child of divorce. Her parents were divorced several years before the book begins. And she was very close to her father, whom she now sees on the occasional weekend. In fact, one of the inciting incidents at the beginning of the book is that she overhears a phone message that her father has left for her mother, that I can't take her this weekend. And she feels like she's betwixt and between with both her parents.
Right.
And so she has learned the hard way to mistrust life. And it's as I said a couple of times, it's like her trip to the 60s kind of undoes some of that damage. So yes, there's that political mistrust that she hears about and discovers in the 60s, but she learns, more importantly, to trust interpersonally.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the two kind of play off of each other in a way, because she falls in with this group who does talk about conspiracy theories and right, oh, that's the government, and oh, that's the government, and all,
Right.
all these things that she mentions, they think that she doesn't know about iPhones and all that. Oh, it must be some government thing. So it's kind of funny, but it is
Right.
their basic mistrust in the government. But more importantly, she's learning to trust other people.
I do really appreciate the fact that both of you, your novels are so character driven, and then when you do bring in these, these other ideas, they do kind of rise up from your characters, which is really great, because oftentimes, one thing, right? You've both written, books that we can, deem, historical fiction, right? That would be one way to describe them, and sometimes you have, like Arin said, right, you do all this research, right? Arin found out about the cap for the champagne bottles. Carla, oh my gosh, you've just explained, how much research you did to make sure that, everything that the psychedelic shop was a real thing. Oftentimes, though, an author will do so much research and they're going to cram it into the book. Oh my gosh, they spent so much time in the library that, gosh darn it, all of that is going, and what it looks like is like, grains of pepper dropped into like a sugar bowl. It's like, so like you can just see it lying there. Whereas both of you, all these, things just rise up out of the story, and it's much more organic, and that's a much harder thing for a writer to do. And both of you do it so well. Right. So congratulations on that. But Carla, like you're saying, right, that you didn't really consider it, kind of a train of thought that you were going to like shoehorn in. It just rose up out of your characters, this like mistrust. I think that really speaks to both of you and the quality of the work that you've done here, that you're presenting these ideas, again, that don't come across, as, we're, tuning into some, ridiculous radio station with somebody that's just, pounding away. And I do, again, so the focus of the night is kind of, the 60s and the influence, on our lives today and on your books. But I do want to talk some about craft. And both of you have characters that are very aware of language. Certainly, Carla, she is, at one point, she's thinking to herself, sometimes it takes a series of waking ups, and then she pauses and says, wait, should that be wakings up? And so just that, where the S is going to go, is, she's, and they make fun when she's talking to this new cast of characters that she meets. I think it's Jimmy that says, you'll love the mouth on her, just because she, is so eloquent with her speech. Adrian, Arin, in your book, also clearly loves language. He's hyper aware of it. His focus on music and on lyrics, his conversations, obviously, with Max, that you can see that wordplay. Why do the two of you think that your characters do have such a love of language that simply comes through, again, very naturally, just in, passionately, in the way that both of them speak? Why do you think that is?
Well, okay, for Mari, she has cultivated a talent with language, as I said, as a means of deflecting her peers. She can, she may not look the way she's supposed to in her mind. She may not be one of the cool girls, but she can put words together like nobody. So that's her superpower. But also, it's kind of a very, only to me, but now, excuse me, I share with you, it's kind of a nod to the songwriter poets of that time. There's a reason why I used Bob Dylan at the beginning, and Joni Mitchell, and all those people who could cram a lot of words into a song, and in amazing combinations. So she's in their tradition.
That's, I had not thought of that. I had played around in my head with why it was important. And I, of course, didn't think that you're making this nod to those wonderful, poets and singer-songwriters.
I wouldn't expect anyone to, as you say, that would be a little bit of the homework showing. But it's just something I've sort of had in the back of my mind.
Well, that is terrific. I love that. Arin, how about with you? Why do you think, why does that show through with our Adrian?
I think in a lot of ways, when I wrote this novel, there were a lot of these little snippets and fragments of ideas that I've had, and I jotted them down as time went on when I was a UCLA student studying English, and it was always in the back of my mind to end up writing something at some point, no matter how long it took. So I think Adrian's very much a vehicle of some of the things, some of the ideas that I've acquired, so that he can be the voice box for those particular ideas. And at the same time, I gave him his own life. I gave him his own personality as much as I could. I tried to use as much imagination and creativity in the process, so it doesn't seem too autobiographical per se, or, I didn't want Adrian to resemble me too much. I really still wanted him to be his own person and shine in his own right. But, and Max as well. Max is, was his character, and he also was the vehicle for certain things. Maybe the old man in me, I think everybody's got that old person in them, who we don't listen to at times, but, so I think that's, and word, I had to be very careful. I reread everything, make sure it flowed a certain way, make sure it was a joy reading. When you read it, it didn't seem too contrived, too dry. You had to have a certain level of perspective and profoundness that I think, to me, and words are very important for that. So the eloquence of the characters really is a reflection of the whole novel, to the end. Yeah.
Well, neither, neither of the books that we're talking about tonight, nobody could ever describe either one as dry. So, again, thank you both for that. I do want to remind everybody, if you have questions, please just click on that Q&A box and type away. And I do want to take a question from there right now. And this is a question also for both of you. And we have Stacy, who is wondering, where did you both find inspiration for your protagonists? And Arin, you touched on that just a little bit, but but if you want to expound on that, and then Carla, also for you.
Carla can go first. You can go. You can go first.
Okay.
Carla.
Well, for the story, I originally conceived of it as a screenplay. But then for various reasons, I was sort of moving away from writing screenplays and writing novels instead. So I used my sort of rough outline of the screenplay as a very rough template for the book. So that's, I hope that the book has a sort of visual quality that probably is because I conceived of it visually first. But in terms of inspiration for the character, she's got some strains of me, especially the 17-year-old me, but kind of on steroids. She's, and I just wanted a sort of present day girl. Actually, she's from 2007, but close enough, far enough away from the 60s. But I just wanted this girl who, had influences that were so foreign to the 60s, like technology, like,
right.
An infinite amount of programming and entertainment available at any moment, and just pressures that were, I think, not existent or certainly differently existent in the 60s. Social pressures,
Right.
pressures in terms of fashion, in terms of how you look, in terms of how you fit into a group. I think it was just a very, very different dynamic now for teenage girls than it was then. I mean, it's never been easy. It's never been easy
Right.
to be a teenage girl.
Of course.
But I
of
think
course.
it's amped up now.
Right.
For me, it was very much the whole process of being an undergrad, and at UCLA, and reading so many books, and you have to hurry, and you couldn't really take your time with any of these novels, right? So you kind of put into this machine, this grind to read 5 books per class, or 3 to 5 books per class, and then you have like 3 or 4 classes, during a quarter. So it can get pretty overwhelming. But during these times, the pressure brought a lot of inspiration as well. And he brought these little sparks here and there, and I had to write those down as quick as possible. So all these little fragments of little quotes, whether they're going to be used as in dialogue, or they were going to used in part of the description in a novel, or part of the self-reflection, the inner monologue of the character, Adrian. So I would later decide what to do with those, and whether to use them in dialogue or more of a self-reflection monologue. So that was many years of these little fragments of things, and he built up and he built up and built up until I was able to, kind of use them in the chapters. I really wanted to write a novel that was the main to help. I don't know if people are familiar with Arthur Schopenhauer, the 19th century philosopher, 18th, 19th century. He always talked about, and this was much later I found out about him when I was doing this. I was like, oh my gosh, he had the same ideas as I did. He loved novels that were very deep and very reflective, and he was not so plot oriented like me. I've always loved, I always wanted to write, a novel that wasn't so much about going places too much, but the plot was really in the characters, and the movement, everything was in them. And so with all these little inspirational quotes that I would come up with, I made sure I got them all down over the years, and then included as many of them as possible in there, into this kind of story about this, about little bits of wisdom here and there that can be helpful for people who read it. They can get something out of it, I think, long after they've closed the book. So that's really the inspiration to write it, and the process itself. It was like literary quilt work, I call it. Or it was like building something, except that the bricks are words, and all that. So
I like that. Well, and something else that you both include Arin, like you were just saying that you were kind of collecting these, little bits of wisdom along the way. You both include music is so important to the works. And this is another question that we have. And the questioner says, did music from the era influence, your novels? And, Carla, of course, I mean, it's there, like we said, from the very beginning with that quote from Dylan, it's there even more importantly with the title of your book, in the park, in that bit that you read, you've got the mandolins and the flutes and the dulcimers, you have the undulating bodies, and she says, and there's another instance of the language, because she says the bodies are undulating, and I don't use undulating very, very freely, but really they're just moving to the music. Adrian has a friend, Clyde, who owns a great music shop, Clyde's Music. And there's one point where Clyde tells Adrian that there's great music to listen to everywhere. And music is so central, again, to the 60s, right? There are few decades that are, as important to, that music is as important to. And so if you both could talk a little bit about, how and why you chose, the kind of music that you chose to use, because Arin, quite frankly, I mean, some of your music was a little more esoteric, right? I think that I've heard a lot of Procol Harum. I've not heard Crucifixion Lane, and so that was a really interesting song title to see, and I had to go and bring it up on Spotify. But if both of you could talk about, since music again is so important, how you chose to again weave in to your stories. And Carla, why don't you go first?
Okay. Yeah. Well, she falls in with this group of people who are a band, and the culminating scene is a battle of the bands at the Fillmore. So the spine of the story is really interwoven with the importance of music. And I this is my opinion, I could be wrong. I feel like the 60s were the first generation, the generation of the 60s were the first people to really imbue music with purpose,
Right.
beyond entertainment value,
Mm-hmm.
or dance music, that it had purpose and it could change the world. And I think that has stuck with us. I think that's really one of the lasting effects. I'm having a hard time finding that in some of today's music, but I trust that people who are younger than I am see that. But I think, and you think about the Beatles, as you said, my title comes from the song Let It Be. And you think about the Beatles hit our shores in 63, 64, on Ed Sullivan in 64, and they broke up in 1970. It's such a tiny little period of time, such a few number of years, but the numbers of changes that they went through musically, and bringing the culture, upheavals of the culture along with them with each change, are just, it's extraordinary for those 6 or 7 years. So I think you can't really separate out music from the times.
That's interesting that you say that it was the first generation where music, was used as this kind of societal, this vehicle for change, because
Right.
the few times it had been done before, right? When Billie Holiday, sings "Strange Fruit," right? She is, right. She is attacked, right? She is desperately put down for even thinking that music could be used in any other way than just for entertainment. And when the 60s happened, like you say, suddenly bands are using it for exactly that. And it was such a groundswell that no longer, right, could the outside attack and say, no, you can't use music for that purpose, because so many people were doing it. That's interesting.
Right.
I hadn't really.
And if I could just continue for a minute, I was thinking about this and thinking about tonight, the difference between my story in 67 and Arin's in 71 in terms of music is kind of interesting, because there were, this groundswell still in 67, especially in Haight-Ashbury, of, they said there was a band practicing in every Victorian house in The Hate. You know,
Right.
you had Janis Joplin in one and Jefferson Airplane in another, but they were still bands. By the time you get to Arin's year, you really start to have the advent of the singer-songwriter, which kind of an interesting evolution, you know, that more emphasis on the individual and the individual's ability for self-expression. So I don't know if Arin has any thoughts about that.
Right.
Well, that's true. Even though that's you know, Adrian's favorite band is Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and he loves Chicago. So he likes really brassy bands. It's like powerful. But yeah, but I think one instance I did include Johnny Mitchell's album when he was with the young, you know, the younger girl, or she was around his age, I believe, in the beginning. But yeah, that was I try to include a bit of both. But music for my novel was really a way to, I think, for all any of the characters to kind of bond, really. You know, I think every encounter, you know, that Adrian had, almost every single one, music was talked about, you know, and I almost feel like in those days he was like, how hip is this person, or how square is he or she, or it was like this kind of conversational icebreaker. It's like, what do you dig, you know, what kind of music, what kind of sound do you dig, you know, or something along those lines, right? And I think, you know, even though he bonds with Max, who's this older gentleman, you know, who has no care, he doesn't care about anything that has electric guitar in it, or it's a little too wild and too crazy, you know. And I think it's also about metamorphosis too, because in Adrian sees the way the music is shifting from, you know, 1970, 71, 72 to 73 with the introduction of like you know, like what's the keyboard that Stevie Wonder plays on, that the Rhodes, right? The Rhodes starts to really start to become bigger than the B3 organ or something like that was more popular in the late 60s, early 70s, for instance, like, you know, with funk music and rock and roll. And so there's that change, right? And so music changes, people also change. There's this kind of gradual metamorphosis that you see, that, you know, you kind of start to see those little changes in those characters as well. So it kind of serves these two purposes, a bonding, and also a little more subtler, that's you know, tends to be about change, personal change, tastes changing, you know, appearances, you know, because nothing stays and lasts the same forever.
Right. Well, and clearly, I could continue to go on forever. I have, you know, my little legal pad is full of questions. We have even more questions from the audience, but our time is fast coming to a close. We have time for just one more question, and I'm wondering, since both books take place in the past, since one of our books, we have somebody who actually travels back in their own time, if either of you had the opportunity to tell your younger selves one important thing, if you could travel back, Carla, what would you tell 17-year-old Carla, and Arin, what would you tell, you know, 20 or 21-year-old Arin? Just curious.
I've thought about this. It's really challenging for me. I think just enjoy the ride. Enjoy the ride, and everything doesn't have to be perfect, which is something that she learns. Right. Very important. Arin, how about you?
Yeah, very much the same philosophy. I say just keep being you, you know, and go with it. And you know, you'll make mistakes and you'll make achievements, and that's life. You know, you gotta have both in order to build character and be a better human being, I suppose, and keep improving yourself. Yeah.
Well, like I said, we could clearly continue this conversation for much longer. I would like to say first, for everybody that joined us tonight, thank you so much. The only way that we can have wonderful conversations with authors is because of you. When you come out and tune in and listen, and more importantly, when you purchase an author's book. if you would like to do that. Certainly, I would love if you purchased these books from Diesel Bookstore. But what I would really love is if you do buy the books, and I think that you should, I would appreciate it if you bought it from an independent bookstore. I'm, of course, very passionate about that, having worked in bookstores for more than 2 decades now. You can get the book wherever you would like, but it would certainly warm my heart if you've got a favorite indie, if you chose to go there. So thank all of you first. Also, again, thanks to the Busby Group for making this happen. Oh my goodness, what a wonderful, wonderful idea that you had to bring together 2 wonderful authors. And then, of course, oh my goodness, Arin, thank you so much. Carla, thank you so much. This was just fantastic. Again, the books are so different and yet share so much, and they really do talk across the years. And so all I can say is, oh my goodness, thank you both so very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great night.
Thanks.